Hi, I'm Mo Lally, president of Mindful Leader and your host for the Mindfulness at Work Summit. And today, I'm here with Professor Ron Purser. Professor Purser is a professor of management at San Francisco State University. He is an ordained Buddhist teacher in the Korean Zen Tigo order. He is the co-host of Mindful Cranks podcast, and his viral article, Beyond McMindfulness, opened the floodgates for the mindfulness backlash. Professor Purser's new book, McMindfulness, How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality, is coming out in July. Welcome, Professor Purser.
Thanks for having me.
Excited to have you here with us. And before we jump into our session, can you give our audience just a little brief background about who you are and how you got involved in this work?
Sure. Well, I've been teaching at San Francisco State University in the College of Business for the last 25 years. And I've been a practicing Buddhist probably about 35, 40 years or so. And so when I saw corporate mindfulness come on the scene, I became very, very interested in what was going on. And it was really quite a blessing in disguise because I was able to merge my personal practice and interest in Buddhism with my professional writings in management field.
Very cool. And for this session, we're going to explore this idea of McMindfulness and given your background and given that you're a professor of business, I would think most people might think that you would take an opposite stance. So let's start with what do you define as McMindfulness? Maybe you could take us back to that article that you put out, I think it was 2013, Beyond McMindfulness, that got
Sure.
this all started.
Right. Well, I think mindfulness is a lot of things. One aspect of McMindfulness is I believe that it reduces mindfulness to a form of self-help, a therapeutic intervention for adjusting and accommodating the self to the neoliberal ethos of capitalist economy, because that resonates with a highly individualistic way of looking at mindfulness. So McMindfulness looks at how stress has been pathologized and reduced to being seen as an individual level problem without taking into account the socio-political and economic forces and structural conditions, which also may be contributors or factors in the generation of stress in our society. So that's part of what mindfulness is. It also has to do with, you could say, the commodification and the mass commercialization, the branding of mindfulness as a commodity. It's a brand that is promoted by the veneer of science, and it's sort of marketed as an idealized lifestyle choice. So it becomes a capitalist spirituality, if you want to call it that, kind of a fashionable spiritual commodity. So it's interesting. It's called McMindfulness. There's actually a social theorist by the name of George Ritzer who wrote a book called the McDonaldization of society, and which also addresses the commodification, the kind of move towards mass standardization and producing scalability, all those sorts of things that you would see like in the fast food industry. But it's not limited to the fast food industry.
I think personally, I'm sorry to just jump in. So was the term McMindfulness something that you came up with, just so our audience has a clear sense?
No, it's actually Miles Neal who came up with the term originally. Although I first heard the term when I was listening to Willoughby Britton from Brown University, a talk she gave at the Buddhist Geeks conference, and I had never heard the term before.
Gotcha. And that stuck, and it was the article that you co-wrote that really got it out there, because I feel like I've heard so many folks talk about that. And I'm curious, before we get into some more of the weeds of this, in your bio, I shared that you're an ordained Buddhist teacher, and so you're coming at this. You're not against Buddhism, and I imagine you're not against some of the things that excites people around mindfulness, and so you're
Oh,
sort of
not at
coming
all.
at this with that lens. And I'm curious also. Let's start by speaking to that. So if you could share with folks, maybe a little bit of what excites you about Buddhism or meditation. What are some of the benefits you've experienced, and what are some of the things that you feel are beneficial to folks? And then I want to start to transition and examine another piece, and then really get into it.
Sure. Well, before we get into that, I'd just like to say that I think this critique, the McMindfulness critique, could actually stand on its own without any kind of Buddhist uh, bias or positioning Buddhism in the conversation. I think this critique could actually stand on its own. But to answer your question, sure. I've derived enormous benefit from Buddhist meditative practices, not just one in particular. In fact, before 2013, to be honest with you, I never really understood what mindfulness was because I came more out of the Tibetan Nyingma tradition and the Zen tradition, where mindfulness is not really the center point at all. So I had to educate myself a lot by going into the Satipatthana Sutra and learning about the early Pali Canon and how mindfulness was very central in that tradition, in Vipassana tradition, insight meditation tradition. Um, but certainly, I think the core benefit, it's really about uh, overcoming dualism, overcoming the sense of separation from self and the world. I mean, that's fundamentally the bottom line for me that we're all struggling with and actualizing that in our lives.
Gotcha. And Professor, my reason for mentioning that wasn't because I feel like we can't explore this without that, but just to give people a perspective that your critique is coming, I believe, from a place of heart and caring, and not just sort of an outsider just sort of leaping on something that's trendy. Um,
Right. Well, it's partly that, though.
that's always part of it. So on the flip side, the other thing I want to examine is are you a capitalist? And so you're coming at this sort of with a critique on capitalism. Do you identify as a Marxist, or what's sort of your perspective there?
I've been thinking about that a lot more lately. I, I, I'm within a capitalist economy. We're living within a capitalist system right now, currently. Um, I would see myself more as a social democratic, a democratic socialist, uh, and a Bernie Sanders variety. But I think that's really interesting. I mean, if you listen to the Dalai Lama, he's an avowed socialist. There's a book called "Why the Dalai Lama is a Socialist," and so I think that raises interesting questions about the recontextualization of mindfulness. Right now, it's been recontextualized right in the center of our capitalist system, and it doesn't have to be that way. There may be alternative ways of reframing and repurposing mindfulness so that it's not so resonant with our Western consumerist values and individualistic hyper individualism. Um, so, yeah,
So, so you're saying that you kind of fall more into socialist, democratic socialist. You're not against capitalism altogether. You're not a Marxist, but you're sort of in this place where I think a lot of folks might be, which is we're working within a capitalist system, and how do we make that work?
right. A progressive, socially democratic stream. Yeah.
Gotcha. Cool. And to come back to the subject, mindfulness, I recently stumbled across, there was an article Slavoj Žižek wrote around Western Marxism to Western Buddhism. And I see you nodding your head, so you're probably familiar with that. And it seemed like there was some similar critiques, and I feel like maybe maybe even went sort of a little bit deeper with some of his jabs.
Right. Yeah, his critique has been around. Um, I, I, I resonate. I totally resonate with what he's saying. Sure. And I think that has to do with his notion that uh, he didn't really critique mindfulness at the time. He was just talking about Western Buddhism in general, but I think it certainly falls under that umbrella. Uh, that it could be used to justify and stabilize the status quo. So it becomes kind of greasing the wheels to reinforce consumer capitalism. So I mean that's part of his critique, but I think there's a lot more that can be said beyond that.
Gotcha. And to come back, you mentioned this idea of stress and it being self-imposed and not really recognizing the impact of possibly the system and how it contributes to our stress. To me, that sounds like a very Marxist kind of exploration and sort of this way that the system affects us, and we can. There's many ways to go from there. I'm just curious if that's where you came at that from, and I feel like it's a very valid critique, but just curious if we could explore that a little more together. This idea of stress being self-imposed, and if it's not self-imposed, where's it coming from, and what do we do with that?
Right. I'm not so sure that I'm coming at it from a Marxist angle. I'm coming at it more from Michel Foucault's work, um, which I don't think we don't have the time to dive into his work, but there is a discourse out there about stress that I don't think it's really been critically examined. And one is there's a discourse that stress is an epidemic. In other words, that it's inevitable. It's omnipresent in capitalist culture. So if it's a given, if it's a natural given, then that narrative would then tell us that it's up to us to mindful up. In other words, it's up to us to become resilient entrepreneurs of ourselves so that we could manage our emotions and enhance our human capital so that we can be valuable in the marketplace. So there is this these premises that that stress is an epidemic and it's inevitable. And by doing that, it sort of pushes away any kind of critical examination or inquiry into the social and political sources that are also these environmental stressors that are also entangled with personal stress. So stress is not just an individualized pathology, but it's entangled in the systemic and structural system of society. And unfortunately, this is part of my critique, is that mindfulness, as it's currently conceptualized, is seen as an individual level behavioral intervention, which obviously, because it comes out of a biomedical paradigm, which sees the individual as something, the individual is the unit that you treat at a medical level. So I think that the stress discourse has these underlying ideological components that the mindfulness movement hasn't really taken time out to mindfully, critically examine.
Interesting. It reminds me, I was at a conference, a business conference on resilience, and they were talking about these different programs to help employees with resilience and stress management. And someone raised their hand and made that point that said, you know what? You're the guys, that's the executives and the management that are creating all this stress. And then you're turning around and giving us an app? Like, really? And so I think more and more folks are asking good questions around that.
Yeah, I think the apps are very symbolic of this critique in terms of reducing it um, to a technique that it's kind of ironic. You have to turn to an app on your iPhone because the iPhone is the source of distraction. But I think that it's mindfulness has been framed within the biomedical paradigm. So by doing that, it kind of cuts away any kind of inquiry into our history, our social and political context of stress. And what that does is it by nature individualizes what could be very more collective and social problems. There's a woman in the UK, I read a book by her, and she coins the term stressism. And stressism is kind of an ideology that all of our stress can be accounted for as a lifestyle problem. In other words, not linked to social forces at all. And I think that's problematic.
Well, there's a trade-off, because when we think of the individualist sort of power, we feel empowered by that, right? So when people feel that they have control, they have empowerment, then the trade-off is that sometimes other things like this also become, we become the source of that as well. So what do you suggest? So I get this criticism around stress being self-imposed, and this idea that we might want to look at it a little bit differently. And it's the fair criticism, and there's others that are out there that are looking at this. Recently, we shared a video around this idea of moral injury in the healthcare field, where the idea of burnout is victim shaming, and that it's really the system that's creating some of these really horrific statistics around suicide rates with doctors and healthcare professionals. And so there's a conversation emerging around this, which I think is exciting. But when you look at this, and in that particular video, there's this sort of meditation isn't the answer, and they take kind of a shot at it. But can you see a role for mindfulness and meditation? Or do you see it sort of warping into something or evolving into something, or what do you think would be an optimistic kind of potential future that we might want to strive towards?
Yeah, I think if we look at any mindfulness program, we have to think of it as a pedagogy. There's a curriculum involved, right? There's training, there's modules, whether it's 8 weeks, but there's a curriculum, and that pedagogy is not set in stone. So I think there are opportunities for rewriting the curriculum to bring in more critical analysis, so that we can have inquiry. And we talk about inquiry in MBSR, where people talk about their experience, but we can expand the scope of that inquiry to look at examining systemic and structural problems that really can't be solved at the individual level, even if you're taking personal responsibility for your own well-being. They really require this more like civic mindfulness, like focusing collective attention that connects our personal work on self-care with social and political engagement. And there are people out there. There's a woman in the UK that is already kind of moving in this direction. Part of the Mindfulness for Social Change Network, Paula Haddock, in the UK. So she's moving away from the clinical and therapeutic applications to incorporate these analysis of systemic causes, social, economic, environmental problems, still supporting personal well-being, but bringing in more of a social justice perspective to it. So I think that the field is wide open, and I already see movements in this direction. So I think there's a lot of hope that mindfulness is in its infancy in terms of its secularization and recontextualization. So I think other innovators could do a lot of good in moving in that direction. It's more systemic.
And what would you feel might be a threat to that? What are your concerns? What are the things that we might want to just be aware of?
Well, I think one of the threats is that corporations, and I'm talking about private corporations, I I think they would be threatened by programs if you were going to try to pitch a program to a corporation and tell them that, oh yeah, this is not just about teaching people how to calm themselves, but we're actually going to take a really kind of uh, close look at our corporate culture and see what sort of corporate practices and policies or managerial behaviors are factors in causing workplace stress. There's a really interesting study by the Stanford Graduate School of Business. You may have seen it. It's been out a while, but it was a meta-analysis of 228 studies. This was kind of a workplace wellness study. And it was saying that employee stress is really not self-imposed at all. It's rather that these stressors were associated with like lack of health insurance, the threat of constant layoff and job insecurity, or the job didn't allow much autonomy, long work hours. And so I think the threat is that I'm not so sure whether corporate sponsors would want to buy into that sort of program that would call into question even the products that corporations are producing. Or to do that is, to me, would be a threat to the center of corporate power.
Interesting. And one thing that I was curious, a point that you made earlier was that with the mindfulness kind of curriculum, it's a pedagogy and it's something that could evolve. But also, I'm wondering who is the steward, who would evolve it, and who is sort of being, who's being granted that power. Because ultimately, if there's sort of change that happened there, it just feels like you've got some of the biggest influencers in this space are corporations and small startups that are, the headspaces and the calms of the world. And so it seems like they've got the most ability and influence to define the curriculum.
Well, that's why I would be skeptical of whether it was in their interest to take a systemic view of their own. I've heard stories of headspace corporate culture as being quite not as humanistic as you may think from insiders.
Yep. And I feel like there's always stories out there, and just not having folks present. I just want to kind of caution not to go into too much details with that, but I feel like there's a natural tendency within the capitalist sort of system and organization to sustain itself. And so I can imagine that. And
Yeah, there's an excellent scholar, Nicole Ashoff. I really like her book called The New Profits of Capital. And she makes the point that in order for capitalism to reproduce itself, it has to draw on cultural ideas that exist outside of its domain space of profit making. And I think mindfulness has kind of been brought into that as a new cultural idea. And so in that sense, I'm really skeptical of whether the fulcrum of change is going to occur in the corporate mindfulness space. I'm thinking it may occur more in the progressive grassroots space that we're beginning to see with all these various movements emerging, especially with the climate emergency. I think that that is really, there's so many interrelated, like environmental justice, racism, all these sorts of oppressive effects of capitalism are pulling people into a new space that is, to be honest, is a challenge to corporate capitalism. So that's why I could be rich if I had taken up the banner of corporate mindfulness. I could be rich, but I decided to stay on the sidelines, and I'm more of a cultural critic.
gotcha. And I am personally involved with corporate mindfulness, but I'm not.
I know.
So I don't know.
Okay. Well,
Seriously. But so back to this idea of where do we go from here? And I know that you've mentioned this idea of collective awakening, and you're talking about grassroots, and we've actually seen and heard from a lot of folks who have started programs within companies in a grassroots organic way. We're seeing more and more, and I just read an article today about within corporations, activists. And so Amazon recently had a board meeting, and I think it was like 7,000 employees signed a petition to get Amazon to take a closer look at the impact its practices has on the environment. And so we've heard that similar things happen at Google and Microsoft, where the employees are organizing and pushing back. And I'm curious if you had any thoughts about that.
I don't know if I have anything that relevant to say about that. I'm aware of those, like the Google walkout, was protesting sexual discrimination. I have a friend who works at Google, and he was part of that. Um, I think that's all good. But I think we're still back to the question, uh, are we going to move beyond just the individual level framework in terms of how mindfulness is being sold in the programs that are out there, and whether or not it will diffuse into corporations or not? Will that sort of systemic approach to civic mindfulness or social mindfulness, whatever you want to call it, will that take in corporations or not? I don't know. I think that's an open question. So I'm hoping that people are starting to think about these questions, and I'm happy that you are one of the few people who are bringing in people like myself. So I think that might help open up the dialogue and get people to think that there's more than one way to frame and conceptualize mindfulness. Really, I think you're doing a good service for that.
Thank you, Professor Purser. And a couple more questions I'm curious about. Sometimes people will make the argument that if even with these corporate mindfulness programs, even with sort of these very light self focus, stress relief type programs, that it creates an opening. And so even though it's not ideal, that it could lead to what you're suggesting, and that in order to reach a large population of people, that really these casual sort of uh, funded ways of doing things ultimately reach a lot of people. And then even though we're not at that collective awakening, it does plant the seed. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that I'd be the first to say that if mindfulness is providing benefits to the individual, I applaud that. But to go from there to make these exaggerated, overinflated claims that's often couched as the Trojan horse claim, I don't know. It's an open question. It sounds really promising. So yes, I'm all for any kind of opening that may occur. But we've been waiting a while for those army men to come out of the Trojan horse and overturn whatever needs to be overturned. It hasn't happened yet. But I think in order to arm those people in the Trojan horse, to give them more ammunition, they need different frameworks. They need different curricula, different tools that will expand their opening at the individual level, and then pull in a sense of collective solidarity that then can have more power to confront these sources of suffering, which are not just inside someone's head. They're not just a privatized form of suffering. So
Very good.
I guess we have to wait and see.
Yes. And another question I have for you, just around the, say, it's sort of the container and the atmosphere around the mindfulness community right now. You mentioned that that I'm one of the few that has reached out to you. How do you have concerns around that? And I could share for me, I do really enjoy and feel like more debate and kind of challenging and dialogue will lead to something that ultimately we'll all benefit from. And I'm curious if you're how how you see things. And I mentioned the Mindful Cranks podcast, and just curious um, if you're involved in those conversations and what's happening around that.
Right. Well, I'm pretty happy. Back in 2013, when I first wrote Beyond McMindfulness with David Loy, I felt very alone. Um, but slowly people started emailing me, and I started making a lot of friends all over the world. So I realized there were a lot of people like me that were having the same concerns and thinking critically. And so over a period of time, a network has really developed to that. So I really don't care that much whether or not I'm part of the mainstream uh, conversation in the mindfulness movement. Um, that doesn't really concern me. I'm really happy to see so many colleagues that have emerged, which are doing great writing. There's lots of writing coming out now in different fields, and um, so I think there's a counter narrative emerging that could, at least have some influence in moving us towards a more collective, civic, critical way of uh, offering mindfulness in a different way that's not limited to the individual therapeutic conception of it.
Interesting. And in your bio, I read and opened the floodgates for the mindfulness backlash. Can you speak to that just a little bit? That was your words.
Well, that's a little journalistic flair there. Well, yeah. I mean, when I first wrote that article, there were all these rebuttals that started to emerge. It became a real controversial debate. And I think about a year or two after that, you began to see other aspects of mindfulness being criticized, especially about the adverse effects of meditation and that sort of thing. So the backlash was just kind of a broad umbrella term for people that were starting to say, wait a minute, what's all this hype about? And let's step back here and what's really going on here, and take a more critical look.
Gotcha. And Ron, what would you say to folks who have people tried to engage you, and have you had opportunities to engage with them, and have you tried to engage, the mainstream, or however you want to call it, the other folks that might have different positions, to engage in dialogue around this?
Oh, sure. I've been to the Mind and Life Institute conferences, and I've been to mindfulness conferences in Bangor, in the UK. Bangor University has quite a large conference, and I've been on many panels, uh, uh, numerous debates at various conferences. Uh, so yeah, I've been in conversation with some of the folks in Silicon Valley. I ran a really large conference here in San Francisco in June 2015, and about 325 people showed up, and I was really surprised by how many people were sympathetic to the critiques. Um, so yeah, maybe the atmosphere is changing, and being more receptive to these sorts of critical perspectives on mindfulness.
And I believe so. I hope so. I feel like maybe we're starting to look at what's happened politically, with people sort of kind of getting entrenched in their camps, and not really having conversation, and not pushing things forward, and maybe re-examining how we're doing things. Cool. So, Professor Purser, any closing thoughts before we come to a wrap here?
Well, I think that we're moving, we have the potential to move in a more socially engaged direction with mindfulness. And I'm really hopeful that people on the fringes, perhaps people not in the mainstream, maybe people that have their foot in one world and another foot in another world, can uh, feel courage to develop new approaches that can take us to a more systemic understanding of the causes of social suffering and not be beholden to the neoliberal co-optation of mindfulness. I think there's a great potential for that.
Gotcha. And I feel like, and you mentioned this a couple of times, the neoliberal takeover of mindfulness, and that's just an area I don't want to debate or go into. So, but I wouldn't really call that out because I don't want to say that's something I agree with, but I just feel like it's not going to be as helpful to our audience to explore at this time. Um, Professor Purser, for folks who might want to learn more about your work and engage with you, what's the best way they could go about doing that?
They can go to my website, ronpurser.com, www.ronpurser.com. Or they can, if you want to learn more about neoliberal mindfulness, you could look at my new book that you mentioned. It's coming out in July. McMindfulness, How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality. It's on Amazon. So,
Great. Well, this was really a good session. I think folks will benefit from hearing from you and maybe kind of think about things in a slightly different way.
thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and that brings our session to a close.